So welcome. I've been wanting to make this video for a while now, and it's a very complex video because the topic is so broad. And even though I am a big fan of Hegel, I don't feel like I'm an expert at all. Like I've read quite a lot. Even though I'm not an expert, I'm gonna do my best to try to convey why I think Hegel is so important. Why would you want to read him? And I'll try to dip my toes into the general idea of his most important book, in my opinion, which is the Phenomenology of Spirit. So yeah, this is a Hegel-related video, finally. Let's go. So here are the timestamps. I'm going to go into Hegel's biography, I'm going to go into the myths of Hegel, and then I'm going to go into why I think it's important to read Hegel nowadays. And in that last point, I'm going to talk briefly about my favorite book, which is the Phenomenology of Spirit. So if you follow me or you have seen my vlogs, you realize that I always travel with this book, and I have it annotated everywhere. So every time I read it, I add a different color, so you can tell I have read this book quite a lot. Since I'm very bad with specific dates, I'm going to be reading some of the information over here because I don't know it by heart, so I hope you can forgive me. But okay, here's what it is. Hegel was born on the 27th of August of 1770, and he died on the 14th of November of 1831. So he lived 61 years. During those 61 years, he made, I will say, 4 books. Technically 5, but in reality 4. Those 4 books are The Phenomenology of Spirit, The Science of Logic, The Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, and Philosophy of Right. Those are the 4 books. There's some other books who are supposed to be by Hegel, but are not by him. Those are the books compiled by his students, which are the Lessons on Aesthetics and the Philosophy of History. But those books are not really written by Hegel. Those are notes taken by his students. So he was 31 in 1801, and he published his first book called The Difference Between Fichte and Schilling's Systems of Philosophy. He was working as an unpaid teacher in the University of Jena. He was teaching metaphysics, and he realized he needed the money because, you know, you need money to live. So he made a deal with a publisher, and he offered to publish The Phenomenology of Spirit, which will serve as an introduction to his system. Now, bear in mind when I say a system of philosophy, this was like the big thing. Every big philosopher, or if you were a philosopher, like a serious philosopher, you wanted to make like a system so that all the thought that could be thinkable will fit into your system. One of the most famous attempts of it is Kant, the critique of the pure reason, critique of practical reason, and critique of judgment. And there's a clear path in that direction. So Hegel sees this, and by the time Hegel is publishing, Kant is still like the truth. It's like the main guy everybody talks about. So he wants to write a philosophical system. And he talks with a publisher, and he decides to publish The Phenomenology of Spirit. And he started writing this book. He was 35 when he finished The Phenomenology of Spirit. Now, this book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which is my favorite book, as I've already said, it's so dense. Like, you have no clue how dense this is. Every paragraph of this book, like, you can summarize whole books into 1 or 2 paragraphs of this book. There is no filler at all. There is nothing that is unnecessary. There is no random worthiness just to sound cool. No, everything in here has a purpose. Everything in here is placed just where it needs to be. It's like a mechanical clock that works perfectly. This is what the book is, and he wrote it when he was 35 years old. Moreover, just to explain how metal this guy was, when he was finishing the last pages of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Napoleon was invading Jena. So he saw Napoleon riding right outside his door, and he was like, oh, well, there it goes, you know, the spirit of our time, the spirit of our world, the Weltseele. He says the word Weltseele, which means like soul of the world, is passing outside of my window and about to, you know, develop his needs, because the spirit of the world does not care about you. It's just, it has to fulfill the mandates of the world. In this case, Napoleon wants to, you know, conquer. Once he finished that, he got a job, and he was basically the chairman, the main boss of a school in Germany. And he worked on that thing until he was 46. And he wrote The Science of Logic, which is another book that I have over here. This is The Science of Logic. And this book is even harder than the Phenomenology of Spirit. So I'm just focusing my efforts in tackling one book at a decade. So when he finished that, he was offered a job and giving lectures in the University of Heidelberg. And there, his students were like, "Grandpa, that's great. You know, your books are cool and all, but we don't understand any of it. It's just too complex." So he decided to write the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences to talk about his books. Think of this as the student's version of his books. So if you're looking for an easy way in Hegel directly, this might be the most clear way of getting in. So in 1818, he became the chair of the Department of Philosophy in the University of Berlin. That's awesome. And 4 years later, he published the Philosophy of Right. And the Philosophy of Right is exactly that. It's the philosophy of right. This is probably Hegel's less complicated book. It's written in a very clear way clearer than The Science of Logic and way clearer than the Phenomenology of Spirit. So it's not uncommon for people who are getting into Hegel to delve into this first, because if you come from the Marxist tradition, this will fall right in your alley. So these are the 4 books Hegel published during his lifetime. He published other things like small essays and whatnot, but this is the main body of work. So when you talk about Hegel, and you talk about his books, you talk about this books. It's not a guy who used to publish and publish and publish and had to be on the grind of an academic career. He was interested in writing a systematic approach to his whole way of thinking, and that's what he did. He basically wrote that. Main myths about Hegel that everybody talks about, but they're not true. Let's tackle the first one, which it's pretty common, and it's the idea that Hegel is all about thesis and thesis and synthesis. That's not true. I'm sorry if you ever heard that. I'm sorry if a teacher ever told you that. That's not true. That's not even said one time throughout all the books. That's an idea of Fichte, and in reality, Hegel makes fun of that idea. You can make an effort and try to fit any kind of dialectical thought into that method, but doing that and saying that, oh, something A happens, then something B happens, and then something C happens as a result of A and B. Sure, buddy, but that's not different as saying, hey, there's Act 1 and then Act 2 and there's Act 3. Therefore, everything can be 3 acts. It's just an overarch kind of structure that you can put as a cookie cutter into everything, but that does not mean that Hegel's book followed that structure. Another great myth. Hegel was in favor of the monarchy. He believed the Prussian state was the most perfect state. That's not true at all. Imagine it this way. Hegel was a revolutionary. He was with his students. He used to go to a bar with his students and, cheer in the name of the French Revolution. When he was doing that, cheering in the name of French Revolution, this was like the most subversive thing you could do. Yeah, let's praise for this guy who took the power and killed the rich. That sounds like a swell thing. Super revolutionary, because Hegel was against the monarchy, but you cannot publish things against the monarchy inside a monarchy system. So you have to find ways around it. So what he does is he explains the whole argument of, how the right emerges, what is the state, how can we think of the state. He presents the king in such a way that it's an important figure, but it can be replaced by more democracy. So Hegel is a firm believer in democracy as a representation of the whole spirit, of the whole body of people in a country. An idea that was highly revolutionary by the time. Once you get to the spirit section of the Phenomenology of Spirit, you say yep, he's clearly going for a revolution. That's what he's basically stating for. It is said that Hegel inspired the Nazis, just like Nietzsche, which is untrue, of course. Poor Nietzsche is always get drawn in the Nazi rhetoric. I mean, there are Nazi philosophers. You have Heidegger, for example. Heidegger is a Nazi, and that's just his deal. He's a great philosopher. He's very smart. He was not a good person at all. He used to work with Husserl, and then he basically ditched him and made his life impossible. He was an anti-Semite. He was a douche. But his philosophy is pretty good. So you have to learn how to navigate both things, to acknowledge that Heidegger was a douchebag and at the same time he was a great philosopher. That does not happen with Hegel. Hegel never said, Germany is the best thing of everything and we should conquer the world. There is an Eurocentric argument to be held on Hegel, of course. Like, I have a book about it it's called Hegel and the what's the name of it? Hegel and the Third World. And there they explore, the Eurocentric perspective of Hegel. Of course, it is Eurocentric. We're talking about the French Revolution just happened. Like, there's an emancipation of the working class in France, like in your neighborhood country, and you're trying to bring that thing into Germany and develop the new system of thought that could develop democracy to the next level. How could you not be Eurocentric? Like, that's probably one of the most important moments of world history. It's where the conventions begin. So come on. And the last myth, which I really don't like, but I hear it a lot, it's well, Hegel's all good, but he was too intellectual. Marx put it on his head. Marx, the real deal. As a Marxist Hegelian, I really like the guy. I really like Marx. But he did not put Hegel on his head. What happens is that on this book, The German Ideology, Marx writes the thesis on Feuerbach. And in his thesis on Feuerbach, he talks about how idealism, Hegel in particular, was all about, the idea of the world as an intellectual. Ideology, for Marx, is the expression of the real material conditions as an idea. Which sounds super good, and I agree, but that's exactly Hegel's argument. So what happens is, Marx did not read Hegel through. He just got a copy of The Science of Logic, which was Bakunin's copy, and he read excerpts on the philosophy of right, but he wasn't familiarized with the phenomenology of spirit, and he did not read The Science of Logic through, like cover to cover, so he had no idea about the real Hegelian project. Nowadays, it's comfortable for me to say that because nowadays we have so many secondary, readings on Hegel, so we know more or less the tradition. If you become like a serious Hegelian scholar, you know how the interpretations of Hegel have gone through the years. But on Marx's time, that was not available. You only had like one copy if you could find one, and then you had to study, and it was like immensely difficult to understand. So, I get it. Marx did his best, but he was not a great Hegelian at all. So he did not understand the Hegelian project. The Hegelian project is exactly that. It's the idea that the act of living under certain material conditions which obey to a certain kind of appropriation of capital in this case, develop as ideology for the rest of us. That's why you have different ideologies according to the different social strata or according to, the place where you're born, the society you're in, the religions you're being raised into, etc., etc., etc. But there's a logic to be said on that. It's not just, this is what happens, and that's not a philosophical argument. That's just common sense. The most complicated thing is giving all of that argument a logical structure and to explain why that is. And that is the Phenomenology of Spirit. These books are written in a dialectical way. The connection between two objects is more real than the objects themselves. This is a philosophy of processes. It's a philosophy of things that emerge as a connection between things. For example, the act of walking. You go from point A to point B. What Hegel is focused on is not point A or point B, is the logic that you use when you walk. Which feet you lift first, when does it move, when it falls down. Does that create a pattern? Does that pattern repeat itself? If it repeats, how often does it repeat? Why does it repeat? Does it have to do with a biological structure? Do you limp? Do you have a shorter leg than the other one? Why do you have that? What's the historicity of your limping? There's a lot of complex issues in the act of walking as a process that is not necessarily connected to going from point A to point B, is the act of walking. If you can find the patterns and the structures of those processes, you can understand the patterns and processes of more complex processes. So the Phenomenology of Spirit is a book about consciousness. It's basically an epic novel which has consciousness as the main character. And it begins with consciousness in its most simple and direct way. It begins with consciousness as sense certainty, which is the first chapter. Imagine you're a consciousness, right? Imagine you're a consciousness. It's weird to say, but just follow me on this one. If consciousness has absolutely no input and it's just there in a void, any input that happens, being light, a ground, gravity, wind, a sound, anything, it's getting directly into consciousness. There's no other process. Consciousness has no ears, it has no eyes. Something is impacting consciousness. And what impacts is an immediate knowledge. Now Hegel says, in some traditions, that is taken as the most perfect and pure way of knowledge. But to me, Hegel tries to explain, this is just the most basic of knowledges. Because it's not tied to reason. It's not tied to the world. So we're going to go through all those stages. So the book begins with a first impression, a sense certainty. And then it goes into the properties. Like I see an object. Does it have properties? Yeah, it's a book. It's yellow and it's squared and it's thick. Okay. How do those properties connect with each other? It's yellow and square. And it's not red. So it becomes connected with other objects by a negative relation. It's square because it's not round. It's small because it's not big. So every time you assert something, at the same time you're negating other things. But at the same time, it is possible, logically speaking, to assert things that are not connected. It is square because it is not red. You can connect the properties of it in any other way you want as long as they're not contradictory. The act that there is contradiction inside the properties and the fact that you can sense the properties tells you about the passage of time. This here is yellow, but if I burn it, it's no longer yellow. This thing over here is burnt. It changed from yellow to burnt, and that process of changing is the passage of time, and you're aware of that passage of time. That's what Heidegger goes into in Time and Being. That's what the sign is the awareness that functions on self-consciousness. If you're not familiar with Kant, chapter 3 of the Phenomenology of Spirit is just a hot mess that is really hard to untangle. When I got into chapter 3, I was not familiar with the Critique of Pure Reason, so I had to pause my reading of Hegel and then go back to the Critique of Pure Reason to understand what the hell the argument was, what was Hegel responding to, and then go back to the Phenomenology of Spirit and see what the hell was it all about. The Coulter section of the Spirit section is where he starts explaining how this whole thing works. Then he goes into, of course, the French Revolution, the development of freedom, and then he goes into religion. I mean, this book is the whole deal of going through the development of consciousness. That's what this book is about. If you just grab this book and say, like, I'm going to read it on the weekend, you're not going to get far. You're going to get frustrated really quickly. When I started reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, I used two books that helped me tremendously. First, this book called Hegel by Biochem Fink. On the first chapters in this particular book, he really explains the whole project in detail. I have never seen an English translation of this. I only know it exists in German and in Spanish. Probably the most important book you can find for going through Hegel without getting extremely confused. If you think you're up to the challenge, there's another book which is amazing, and it's one of the canon books for secondary reading on Hegel, and it's this. It's Genesis Instructor of Phenomenology of Spirit by Jean Hippolyte. This is probably the most comprehensive and the most widely accepted interpretation of the Phenomenology of Spirit because it goes into detail, but not too many details. So he gets into the sections, he explains what the sections are about, and then he's just like, okay, I hope you like that. We're moving to the next section, which is something that other books don't do. For example, Hegel's Ladder by H.S. Harris goes slowly. He goes paragraph by paragraph, explaining to you what the main argument is, what other things are connected with it. And he's able to do that because the Phenomenology of Spirit, as I was saying, is a very, very highly dense book. The book is written as a fractal. So if you love meta kind of readings, the Phenomenology of Spirit is the thing you want to read. In reality, when we talk about things, we only use like objective view as a standard of, this is how things are. This is objectively false, But in the Phenomenology of Spirit, that doesn't work because he's talking about the points of view of subjects and objects. He points himself in the point of view of objectivity, for example. So if you're already talking about subject and you're already talking about object, do you have an objective, as we understand it normally, kind of ground? Yes, he plays that ground by putting himself in this big we. We see it as blah, blah, blah. We understand consciousness as this. The other thing that happens is that since he's doing this exercise of presenting points of view and then a farther away point of view, there's some other farther away points of view inside the text itself. So sometimes the text is doing recursive movements. You read a paragraph, you understand it, But then several pages later, he's like, okay, that's one way of seeing it. But we could also see it in this way. And he presents a whole new argument, which is even more compelling than the one you just read for, I don't know, 4 pages, which took you a long time to read because the argument is really dense. And once he finished this other argument, he's like, but this argument is also false. We have to understand it from this other perspective. And now he brings like another new perspective, which is more complex than the other ones before, but uses pieces of them. So he creates logics or ways of understanding things, and then he uses those same logics and he translates them into new grounds. So he's constantly playing with structures throughout the whole text. I mean, it's a beauty. It's a beautiful text. And there's nothing I can quote you, because if I just read a paragraph, you'll say like, that makes no sense. Everything in Hegel has meaning. Everything is so detailed. Everything has specific kind of words. When he says this is pure consciousness, he's not saying it's pure like a good thing. He's saying it's merely consciousness. It's pure. It's not, it has nothing added. It's just in a state. It's undeveloped. Things develop by adding contradictions, which is another key thing in Hegel, which is Hegel is the philosopher of contradiction, is the philosopher of negativity. Not negativity as in, I don't want to go outside, but negativity as things that limit the phenomena. It's very inspired in Spinoza. If you're familiar with Spinoza, you wouldn't find Hegel really difficult, or it won't be too far away from what you already know. If you can understand the limit, if you can see a limit, you can already think outside that limit. So what Hegel does is presenting the borders of every logical operation at every level, and then presenting what is outside those borders all the time. There is no limit to the understanding, which is the basic difference with Kant. For Kant, there are certain things, like the interior of the phenomena is something in itself. And if you think about that, it creates an aporia of reason. There's no way you can understand that. Reason at one point contradicts itself when it tries to dig into the things in themselves. For Hegel, there's no such thing as things in themselves. The phenomena, what you see, is already what there is. Absolute knowledge can be derived from the direct experience of the objects. And that is something, it's a revelation. It's something that is, it's magical, it's beautiful, and it's very aligned with Buddhism, I would say, and with the mystic kind of perspective in which there's no illumination from above. It's not like one day you wake up and you're like illuminated. The world that there is all there is. Therefore, for Hegel, God is already present, manifesting itself in the world. There is no magical afterlife which you go and then you suddenly become one with God, and it becomes like this Christian theology, which he was very against. God is already present in all of us. And I'm coming to this text and to this idea. I'm not a Christian. I'm an atheist, basically. But I can understand the main argument. What he calls God is what Spinoza calls nature, is what we could understand nowadays as reason, as science, as knowledge, as self-consciousness, as the capacity of having impressions, judgments, and being able to navigate reality through those impressions and judgments. There is something working in all of us while we're working in our reality. And that's the main lesson Hegel presents. He's not just saying this, he goes in depth about why this is so. And I think it's important to read Hegel and to understand Hegel, because the arguments, how the arguments are presented, open up so many doors for the imagination and so many doors for understanding how logic operates. It's hard to describe like what Hegel is about in a few words, because it's a massive project. It's a whole philosophical system, and it's all about the development of reality from the perspective of consciousness. That's what the phenomenology of spirit is. That's what the science of logic starts from that point. Like, if self-consciousness as an absolute standing point could be further understood as philosophy or as science, what is the logic that operates inside that concept? And then he opens that concept and presents all the forms in which it is manifested. I will highly suggest you, if you can and you have the time or you have the will or you have like a small doses of curiosity about this, please go into it, because it's by far the most rewarding travel journey I've ever done book-wise. If you are scared of it because you have no idea of Aristotle, you have no idea of Kant, you have no idea of Spinoza, and you have zero notions of the whole phenomenological tradition, this book might be a little bit of an overload. That's what happened with me. I was not familiar with all of this that I'm saying. I knew my way around Aristotle a little bit, but I wasn't like very keen on the guy. So it was extremely, extremely hard for me to get into this book. If you think that you don't really want to go too deep into the phenomenology of spirit, you want to explore a little bit more, then the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences is your book. You can certainly find one of these in the used section of bookstores because people buy Hegel books and then they just never read them. I hope you can. I hope you can read it. If I have motivated you even a little bit to start going into this, please let me know. And yeah, let me know if you're into this kind of format of me talking about books that I really enjoy. I have so many books that I want to talk about. I hope this finds you well. I hope you enjoy this episode. And yeah, stay safe. Stay at home. Love you guys. See you pretty soon. Bye.